Good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today from around the world. Thank you for attending this webinar on fostering resilient societies, inclusive policies for social justice and cohesion, co-organized by the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. Please note that the event will be recorded. To begin our program, we are honored to have opening remarks from the two institutes hosting this event. First, Mika Salminen, the Director General of THL, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Merita. Dear colleagues, esteemed speakers, and distinguished guests, it is really my great pleasure to welcome you all to this important webinar, which is, as was said, co-organized by the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. Today's webinar focuses on the theme fostering resilient societies, inclusive policies for social justice and cohesion, a theme that speaks directly to the intersection of health, well-being, and public policy. These issues are not only central to THL's mission, but increasingly vital in responding to the complex challenges we face globally. As we approach the second World Summit for Social Development in Qatar later this year, nearly 3 decades after the landmark summit in Copenhagen, we have a critical opportunity to reaffirm the centrality of social development in global recovery and transformation. Health, well-being, and social cohesion must not be treated as outcomes alone, but as strategic drivers of more sustainable and just societies. At THL, we are deeply engaged in building knowledge and tools that strengthen health systems, social policies, and institutional capacity. In recent years, a series of crises from the COVID-19 pandemic to armed conflicts, energy disruptions, and growing economic uncertainty have shown just how interconnected our health, well-being, and economic systems are. These events have exposed vulnerabilities, but also underscored an essential truth. The strength of a society cannot be judged by GDP alone. A population's well-being depends on much more than economic output. It is shaped by social cohesion, access to services, equality, and the state of their environment. GDP does not reflect unpaid care work, ecological decline, or growing inequality. This is why there is a need to shift our thinking towards a well-being economy, one that balances social, ecological, and economic sustainability and places people's dignity and future generations at the center of decision-making. Today's program brings together a remarkable group of experts, policymakers, researchers, and practitioners who will offer fresh perspectives on how public policy can better reflect the realities and needs of diverse populations. And I especially want to thank our partners at UNRISD for their leadership in convening these conversations in the lead up to the summit. Your work to enable global networks, promote evidence-based solutions, and elevate diverse voices is essential to building fairer, more inclusive policy agendas. With these words, I wish you all a productive and thought-provoking discussion, and I hope today's exchange inspires both bold thinking and action towards a more just and resilient world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mika. And then next, we will hear opening remarks from Director Magdalena Sepulveda.
Thank you very much. It is really a pleasure to welcoming all to this webinar. It is a very timing webinar. The Second World Summit for Social Development really marked a critical moment to evaluate progress made since 1995 in the Copenhagen Declaration and reaffirm the commitments to poverty eradication, decent work for all, and social integration, while addressing contemporary challenges like inequality, climate change, and global instability. For UNRWA, we played a critical role already in 1995 when it was the Copenhagen Declaration. And we're trying to play also an important role now in order to achieve an outcome that we believe should be transformative. In order to do this, as the only UN institution dedicating to research in social dimension of development, we have undertaken a very global survey in which we received more than 500 responses from experts and practitioners around the world. We also did several regional consultations. So this consultation or this webinar contribute to the discussions that we have been having since last year. And let me give you some flavor of what the world, this contribution of 500 people, have considered important to include in the outcome of the Qatar meeting in November. They have identified 5 big challenges. Those challenges of inequality, governance and political stability, climate change and environmental sustainability, employment and decent work, and poverty and social exclusion. We are delighted to see to some extent these challenges have already been included in the zero draft of the political declaration, which is the outcome expected from the Qatar meeting. These practitioners and experts from around the world that had participated in our survey has also recognized 5 policy demands that they were pushing for to see included in this political declaration. One was about accountable and inclusive governance. Participants call for a stronger governance framework that prioritizes transparency, civic participation, and equitable policy outcomes. They also emphasized the importance of universal social protection, expanding access to social protection systems such as healthcare and pensions was a recurring demand to address vulnerabilities and to build resilience. Education and youth empowerment was also at the core of their demands. Climate resilience and sustainability, policies that integrate environmental sustainability with social development were identified as critical to mitigating climate impact and ensuring equitable low-carbon transitions. And finally, equitable economic system, reforming taxation, redistribution of wealth, and addressing systemic imbalance in the global economic order were underscored as necessary for inclusive development. And as I said, we're pleased that the draft political declaration for the World Social Summit has included some of this demand. We still think that there should be some improvements to the text, that there is a space to keep on negotiating and pushing our states to have a better outcome, as this outcome should be the pathway for our social development inclusion in the future. So again, this webinar, it is an important contribution to the discussion. At UNRWA, we commit to bring forward your voice and catalyze your voice in the negotiation process that have started for the political declaration, but also for the Qatar meeting. So we look forward to hearing your comments, your views, learn from your expertise, and to use this space to facilitate coordination and action for the challenge, to confront the challenges that are coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these inspiring words. So next, we will hear two expert presentations that set the stage for today's discussion by addressing the global state of social development and the tools we use to measure progress. Now, before we go to the speakers, I would like to remind you that during the webinar, we encourage your participation using the Q&A box. So if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to post these during their talks or in the Q&A session at the end of each segment. And also please specify your name and to whom the question is targeted. Let's welcome our first speaker, Katja Hujo, who is the head of the UNRISD Bonn office and leads the Transformative Social Policy Program. Katja will share insights from the UNRISD consultation for the upcoming World Summit on Social Development. Please, Katja.
Thank you very much, Merita. Can you see my screen? Can you all see well my screen?
Yes, very well.
Okay, just need to. So basically, my presentation will be quite complementary to what our director, Magdalena Sepulveda, has already mentioned. I would like to tell you about our conversations with the global public through a survey and go a little bit more into depth on the regional consultations that we have conducted to find out what are the burning issues in the area of social development from different regions. I will also comment a little bit on the zero draft of the political declaration and conclude with some recommendations about the future of social development. So first of all, I think what is very important for us to keep in mind is that the second World Social Summit happens in a very challenging international context. We know that we are grappling with multiple interconnected crises, economic, environmental, social, and political, which threaten SDG achievement, reverse past development gains, and lead to an erosion of trust, credibility, and legitimacy of governments and multilateral organizations. And this is really very important. And I think that one of the key objectives now is to find consensus in a very polarized moment in time to put all our efforts into achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and to putting social development back at the center of development. A second big challenge, of course, is the rising inequalities we are seeing within and between countries, and which are mostly affecting vulnerable and marginalized groups and undermine poverty reduction, democratic governance, and of course also our efforts to address the environmental crises. We all know since the publications of the recent SDG reports that SDGs are largely off track. So this is also a moment, and you will see it in the political declaration, to really recommit also to the last effort to get SDGs back on track as much as possible. And another very important challenge that we are facing at this moment is the increasing backlash that we see against gender equality, human rights, egalitarian and justice approaches, and climate action. And that is quite visibly fueled by extreme right political forces. And finally, multilateralism and ODA and the international rules-based economic systems are under threat. The UN is going through quite a significant funding and credibility crisis. Now, that said, we have already heard that we are firmly on the road towards Doha. The second World Social Summit will be taking place there in November. And as Magdalena already mentioned, it is an opportunity to really address gaps and recommit to the Copenhagen Declaration that was agreed in 1995. But it is also an opportunity to rethink social development, to position it at the center of political agendas, and to reinforce action around poverty eradication, employment, and social integration. Now, I can go very quickly through the global survey, as Magdalena has already mentioned, some of the key challenges and policy demands that the respondents to the survey have put forward. But just to maybe repeat once more, governance, inequality, and climate change were the top 3 problems that were identified, and the top 3 policy demands are in a similar direction. Nevertheless, what is interesting and also very important for many actors, universal social protection came up 3rd in terms of policy demands. And this is a testament to the multiple functions that social protection has, and in many different policy areas, really. But let me go more into depth of our regional consultations. Now, we conducted expert group meetings online in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Nordic countries. And we are also currently organizing a couple of more sub-regional consultations. And these were very important in order to get really more insights into what is happening on the ground, what are the particular challenges in regions and sub-regions, what has been achieved, what is still missing, and what are actually the proposed solutions that our experts put forward. So when we look at Africa, there is a lot of progress, of course, since Copenhagen, but there are also a lot of challenges. And what was raised mostly was the challenge of the very large informal economy that persists on the continent, the problem of youth unemployment, gender equality, and climate change that is more and more affecting agricultural communities, which are still the majority, which is still a very important economic sector in the region. Additional problems that were mentioned were also limited state capacity, in particular domestic resource mobilization, democratic backsliding, and conflicts. Other problems mentioned were the insufficient access to technology and digital services, but also the continuing external dependencies and global power asymmetries. In terms of solutions, what was proposed was decisive action to formalize informal labor markets, especially through extension of social protection and creating pathways for informal workers to transition into secure and decent jobs, scaling up climate resilient agriculture and building more infrastructure, enhancing education and vocational training, and global governance reforms, especially those that provide debt relief to debt-distressed African countries, access to finance, and domestic capacity building. In Asia, again, we have a region where we could see a lot of progress, especially in terms of rapid economic growth, technological progress, a hub for digital innovation, etc. However, what was mentioned from our experts, that we still see very visible economic disparities. Not everyone has access to digital services. We have a lot of policy challenges regarding aging populations, urbanization and migration. So demographic factors are very important. Gender inequalities persist, gender-based violence, social exclusion, climate-related risks, and again, governance issues were mentioned. In terms of the solutions proposed, we see, again, the scaling up and universalization of social protection systems, investments in infrastructure, policies to promote gender equality and address violence, a better integration of climate adaptation policies with social protection, and also strengthened global governance, but also better regional coordination, South-South learning, and exchange of knowledge. In Latin America, again, a region that has made significant progress in terms of reducing poverty and also expanding decent work and social rights. What was mentioned as key challenges are structural inequalities, backlash against progressive policies, climate change risks that are particularly negative for rural and indigenous populations, and digital exclusion. And again, a lot of solutions were proposed by the experts, and they can actually draw on a lot of positive policy experiences that have been tested out in the region, eco-social policies, policies that help to formalize informal workers, action to counter regressive political movements, and also improving accountability and enforcing rights. Finally, the Nordic countries had a very particular consultation. Experts spoke both in terms of their own continuing sustainable development challenges, but also sharing experiences from the development cooperation practices in the past. And as key challenges, we see again social protection, gender, discrimination, lack of finance, new technologies, unequal power relations, conflict, violence, and environmental crises. But again, solutions that basically reinforce also what was already heard from the regions, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, more social policies based on equitable financing, strengthen efforts to combat inequality and discrimination, better governance and accountable institutions, strengthen multilateralism, but very importantly also because this was a consultation that convened civil society organizations, a more prominent role for civil society and academia. Now, I hope you have already seen and have had the opportunity to read the zero draft of the political declaration for the Social Summit, which, as you will see, has actually one of the key objectives to really recommit to core principles to get the global community back on track regarding the SDGs, the Copenhagen commitments, the right to development, but also to have a specific call to action in terms of eradicating poverty, decent work and employment, and social integration, and a discussion of some new issues such as food security, health, digital transformation, gender equality, housing, and migration. And there is also a part on follow-up and review. So let me just say a couple of comments where these political declaration could be improved and what might be issues that the global civil society community, the UN agencies, and all those who actually advise now governments, in this process could put a greater emphasis in order to really, as Magdalena said, get to the best possible outcome in terms of the political declaration. So one important issue would be to strengthen human rights language throughout, especially in terms of gender equality and care, which so far is framed in quite an instrumentalist way, and also no mention of non-binary gender groups such as LGBTQI+ groups. Secondly, social justice and international solidarity is mentioned. However, what is still lacking are concrete policy measures to translate that into practice. A third point is that migrants are mentioned, but in the shortest paragraph of the entire document, not really mainstream throughout and without any concrete commitments. A couple of sectors like health and education are counting strongly on digitalization and artificial intelligence, and also on private sector participation. However, the zero draft as it stands now does not make reference to potential risks and also data protection issues. And finally, the political declaration as it stands, it has many good points, but the integrated approaches such as HDP human development peace nexus or intersectionality approach are missing, we still see that the siloed approach is quite dominant. Now, let me come to my final conclusion. Inequality reduction is something that was very high in terms of the priorities of our survey respondents and the regional consultations. It must feature prominently, but it also must feature in a more comprehensive way than we see it at the moment. Gender justice and care needs a more progressive framing. The rights of migrants and refugees need to be reinforced in a context where we experience backlash and xenophobia. Fiscal policy and redistribution is important, but we also need a new economic paradigm that better delivers on ecological social contracts and on social development. And finally, a topic that is always a bit challenging for outcome documents that are drafted by member states, but that was very high on the agenda from our experts and the global public. Politics matter. We need to also have more democratic governance systems, fight corruption, increase participation and accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katja, for highlighting how inclusive and inclusive processes and also regional diversity, how they are shaping this roadmap towards the World Social Summit. Next, we will have, please, if you have any questions, use the Q&A box. After the next presentation, we will have a short Q&A. Next presenter is Heikki Hiilamo, who's a research professor at the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare, and also professor at the University of Helsinki. Heikki will bring an important perspective on how we think about well-being and how we might also move beyond GDP as guiding metrics of societal progress. Heikki, please, floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me and you can see my screen. So thank you for this opportunity to speak about the very important topic of metrics and especially the topic of GDP. So when it comes to global development discourse, it seems, or economic discourse, it seems that there's still just one game in the town, which is the GDP, and it also gives us an idea of the different countries in the world. So we define development in terms of the level of GDP. So we sometimes, I think very wrongly, think that developed countries are the ones which have high GDP and less developed countries are those which have lower level of GDP. So I'll just share you some ideas on the pitfalls of GDP and possible solutions for developing more sustainable indicators. So GDP is very much about creation of one single person, Simon Kuznets, who's emigrated from the Belarus due to the Russian Revolution and was tasked by the US Senate to draw a system of national accounts to measure production. This is a copy of his original document, or which he submitted to the Congress in 1934. And already then Kuznets realized that production is just production. In this report, what he wrote, and here is the direct quote where he's telling that and no income measurement undertakes to estimate the reverse size of income, that is the intensity and unpleasantness of effort giving into the earning of income. The welfare of a nation therefore scarcely be inferred from the measurement of national income as defined above. So he was quite critical of his own creation already 34, and he said that national income or GDP should not be equated with welfare, but that has not been the case since then. Of course, also the criticism of GDP is quite old. For example, Robert Kennedy in his famous University of Kansas speech in 1968, he said that GDP doesn't measure anything which makes life worthwhile. But that criticism hasn't been heard by the decision makers or the statistical authorities until very recently. So the main shortcomings of GDP actually concern what the GDP doesn't capture, and also what it captures. So the main issue is, as Kasnes indicated, that it doesn't distinguish productive from harmful. It just gives you the value of production, which includes both productive and harmful production. Perhaps the biggest shortcoming is that it doesn't give any account for environmental costs. So the so-called externalities are not included, which means that things like natural resources or nature or the richness of natural life doesn't have any value in GDP. So you can see an increase in GDP and then a total destruction of the environment, which has been the case in some countries. For example, in the 70s, 80s in the small island nation of Nauru. And it also ignores, or actually it includes, military spending. So countries which invest heavily on military spending, they appear to be doing very well. And that is, for example, the case of Russia at the moment, since they have turned into a war economy and they're producing a lot of tanks and guns, but that doesn't give people good lives for Russia or outside Russia. So that is a very big failing of the GDP. Also, the raising inequality, which has mentioned here before, it's not included in GDP. The same goes for economic insecurity. So you can have a very insecure economy which is producing a lot, and that would look as a successful economy, while in fact it is not a successful. And then poor health and well-being are not included. Actually, if people have bad health and then a lot of money is invested in hospitals, for example, or doctors, then it shows you that the country is doing well. And no preventive measures are actually in GDP accounting. They are negative, since they don't show up as a production. And very important omission is also the care work, which has been already mentioned, so that the care work is not included in the GDP or any other home production item. So all the welfare which is created inside the family is outside the GDP. So it seems that the workforce and all the reproductive activities. So for national accounting system, it seems that the workforce is just appearing from the thin air. So there are potential solutions to fix the problems. I guess one of the biggest obstacles so far has been the obsession for a single figure. So the power of GDP is very much tied to the fact that it's a single figure and it's easy to understand and everybody's using it. But it's quite difficult to come up with a one single figure, even if it could be a kind of an index figure like the Human Development Index. But then there is definitely a need for alternative measures, and I think these alternative measures or the demand for alternative measures has been increased by the huge destruction of environment we have witnessed over the last few decades. Just think about the climate change or extinction of species, which are very urgent problems, and they were also mentioned prominently in the UNDRI survey. So those have necessitated the development of all alternative measures. So we can have measures for material and social inequality. We have, for example, the multidimensional poverty index, which is an important index or metrics for development. We have also indicators for economic security, which can be used. We have also a number of metrics for sustainability, like the ecological footprint, for example. We have also measures, attempts to measure well-being beyond GDP, presented by international organizations just such as OECD. So they have developed a full framework for measures of well-being, and that's a very worthwhile effort. But of course, it's something which is presented in the international arena, and it's not bound to a national context. Another alternative is to look at the national context and also to look at this idea of democracy, so that there would be a kind of a public consultation to define the priorities in the areas of ecological, economic, and social sustainability. I have just completed a 3-year development and research program, which has focused on a particular approach, which is known as economy of well-being, where the idea is to balance economic, social, and ecological sustainability. And in the context of this project, we organized workshops and consultations to come up with measures or well-being measures for Finland. And the indicators were developed for 3 different areas of sustainability: social, ecological, and economical. And the idea was to keep the number of indicators fairly limited. So that's why we had only 5 indicators for each area. And we have developed this kind of a dashboard where people can engage with the data sources, and they can also zoom in for more specific indices divided by genders or age groups. So this is just one idea how you can develop further this idea of going beyond GDP. So that's all from my side, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Heikki. So this was a very good short introduction to these different dimensions of measuring well-being. And now we have a few minutes for questions. I see that there's one question in the Q&A box, but also please feel free to add any questions that you have. So there's one to Katja. So many of the challenges presented here could be mitigated or at least made easier to mitigate through unconditional social policies such as basic income. Rather than linking social protection to arbitrary conditionalities or formalizing labor, the efficacy of basic income has been demonstrated in multiple experiments across the world. Could you please comment on UNRWA's view on increasing use of such unconditional social protection policies. Maybe this is also something, please, Katja, go first, and this may be also something that Heikki could comment on.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Definitely, what we see in very comprehensive social policy, social protection systems is that we have different components that are basically shaped and designed to mitigate risks and provide income security for different social groups. And of course, there are a lot of inequalities in the system, especially in countries where a large part of the population is in the informal economy, therefore does not have access to contributory social insurance and relies more on social assistance benefits. I agree with what the person who wrote the comment and the question said, that actually we have a lot of evidence that unconditional benefits can save administrative costs, are less stigmatizing often, and also provide good social protection for the groups that these programs cater for. On the other hand, it depends also a little bit on the context. So we see, for example, that in Latin America, we have more cash transfers that have conditions attached. But in many countries, there are also social services actually that can be used. And in African countries, governments have mostly opted to have cash transfers without conditions attached, precisely for the reason that it's very difficult to actually control the conditions, but also to offer quality social services. For example, if we say that cash transfers are conditional on school and health checkup, school attendance and health checkups, we also need accessible, affordable, and quality social services. So I think the answer is maybe that we want to achieve universal social protection. We want to avoid stigmatization and additional workload for households to comply with conditions. But it depends very much on the country context. And basic income so far is still, I think, a policy that has been more tested in advanced economies, and often in global south countries, the fiscal space is rather limited to really provide a majority population of poor people with a basic income. If that would be possible, certainly it would provide a lot of income security to these populations. Thank you.
Well, if I can say a few words about basic income, of course, I cannot speak for UNRWA and not just speaking as a scholar who has conducted research on basic income. As probably many of you know, Finland had a basic income experiment a few years back. So we have analyzed that, and I've also written a book where I have tried to compile the research evidence on basic income debates and results from many other countries. And I basically agree with Katja. Perhaps I don't agree with the fact that the basic income would be affordable in high-income countries. I don't think it's not affordable even in high-income countries, especially if you think that universal basic income would replace our existing social security systems. And I think in the experience I have studied, basic income has mainly failed to fulfill its promise. So especially if you're looking at cost effectiveness, which is the big issue for all countries going through austerity due to population aging. So I think we need to stick to our previous policies of having some degree of conditionality, and even in global south context, I think universal basic services should be given priority over universal basic income.
Okay, thank you your responses. There are some comments in the Q&A box on the GDP dominance and policy interventions, but unfortunately now we need to go move forward with our program. Thank you, Katja and Heikki, for these presentations. And of course, if you have any comments or questions, maybe you can also add them later. And maybe Katja and Heikki can also write the comments on the Q&A section. I see that there are some coming also now. Next, we are going to turn to our panel presentations. We have 4 different very powerful examples from 4 different regions. And I'm also, we are happy to have not only different regions present, but also different dimensions of well-being. We are going to hear a presentation on community resilience, on care work and its impact on caregivers' health, universal health coverage, and then on eco-social policies. We will start on the grassroots level. So please warm welcome to Ritu Dewan. She's a professor emerita from the University of Mumbai, whose work bridges advocacy and research on rural livelihoods and resistant movements in India. Ritu was the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics, University of Mumbai, and founder member of the first Center for Gender Economics in Asia. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for organizing this event. Of course, it's a very short time, but then there's so much to say all over the country. So I presume your 10-12 minutes will be hopefully well utilized, and we have a lot of time for discussion. Well, India's experience is a lot to learn of what not to do, and a lot of negation of different kinds of components which are there, but there's also a lot of inspiration. And that's really something which I would like to focus on. I will, of course, I have a PPT, which I will be sharing. Please tell me, of course, as usual, whether one can see it or not. And I will not read out from the PPT, but is it showing now?
Yes, just if you can put the presenter mode.
Yeah, okay. Now, I will, of course, just contextualize the issue of the gendered nature of the crisis which is there. And this is not only in agriculture, but all over at different levels, at different components and different aspects of what is happening in India, in particularly the last few years. I'm not romanticizing the past, but certainly I think it's time to recognize what is happening in the present. So just to give you a snapshot of what is that we have been declining in the last 10 years on every single economic indicator where gender is concerned in particular. I'm focusing, of course, it's like I said, I'm not going to read it out, the highest gender gap, the lowest one of the lowest economic participation levels. And yet we have the highest number of agricultural workers in the world, where India is concerned. And majority of the women who work, of course, the participation rate is very low, but almost more than 85% work in the rural areas. A very significant number, almost 2/3, are what we call unpaid family workers. They don't get paid for what they do. And in spite of the fact that women produce 80%, many estimates have come to this calculation of 80% of India's food, yet they don't own land and they're not even recognized as farmers. So therefore, they're out of any kind of a policy component of an agriculture policy is concerned. There is, of course, apart from this snapshot, there are several things which have been happening in India. We've had a huge, and this is, I think, a problem which is there throughout, and it has already been talked about in the earlier lectures, is a huge increase in informalization. And to somehow compound this in a very negative and cynical kind of a manner, there was about 9 years ago a process of a policy of what was called demonetization. That means even the lower notes were demonetized within a matter of 4 hours. And what it did to the informal sector and to informal small enterprises is something which India has still not recovered from. We also, of course, had the national lockdown, and that is during the COVID period. And this is the time really where I want to focus on, is because it's of course COVID was there, but what was a greater problem was a total sort of a very cynical, less than empathetic COVID response policy. The entire country was closed down within a matter of minutes. And with 1/3 of them migrants, you can imagine what they went through. In fact, the scenes of the migrant workers and women and children walking back is something, I think, which we can never delete from our consciousness and from our conscience. During this period of COVID, and these are the three things I would like to really focus on, is that, and this is what I call under the camouflage of COVID, there were many policies, but three in particular, which has just smashed whatever levels of equality to whatever, like I said, I'm not romanticizing the past, but it reduced and it has actually increased inequality levels. One was the withdrawal of every single labor law which the Indian workers, including women, a right of equal wages, opportunity, etc., all of them were withdrawn. The concept of worker and workplace, including home-based work, was redefined. And what it really meant for the agricultural sector is that 97%, that is a majority of agricultural workers, of which about 80% are women, were de-recognized. So even if there are some policies which follow or reforms which follow to impact social policies, etc., etc., if you're not recognized as a worker, then you're not going to get any of the benefits. Now, these labor codes, what they did, apart from banning strikes and various other kinds of, separation of sexual harassment, separation of maternity benefit act from labor laws, what it also does, and this is very clear in the preamble itself, where it says that labor reforms have been introduced, the labor codes have been introduced for what? For the ease of doing business, not for protecting workers' rights. And this is a very fundamental issue. Of course, a lot of opposition to this, which has been going on. The second, which has impacted women very much in particular, and tribal women, what we call Adivasis, again, and these are all carried out in 2020, when the first and the second phase of COVID was on, and people were just focusing on physical survival, forget about even some level of basic nutrition, etc., was environmental laws. And you had 3 acts which were changed: the Rights Act, the Conservation Act, and the EIAs, which were there. And there are many aspects of this, but I'm just focusing on 3 for the focus of time, is that now with retrospective effect, there is no environmental scrutiny or clearance needed for any kind of project, whether by the government or by the private sector. Post facto clearance which is to be given. Privatization of many areas, particularly of minerals, which again impacts the common property resources on which, like I said, particularly tribal women, but even rural women depend on, whether they depend on for water, for fuel, for firewood, for nutrition, even for accessing, going to the toilet, when forests are so very, very important for the lack of any other kind of facilities which are available. And the introduction of this very anti-environmental, I'm not even talking of climate change, because really climate change is a result of the kind of environmental degradations which has taken place. It increases the process of it. What was called non-geographical replacement of forests. Now, what this really means is that you can cut a forest hundreds and thousands of acres in a particular part of the country, say in the southern region where the tropical forests predominate, and replace the same number of trees, if it's possible, in the northern part of the country, which is a Himalayan glacial area. So this non-geographical replacement is something which has led to many movements, many what we call public courts, where these kinds of issues are discussed. The 2020 period, again, under the camouflage of COVID, they were the Farm Acts which were passed. Now, these 3 Farm Acts are very, very problematic. I'm just giving a snapshot of what is there, which replaces, now please remember, India is a country which is primarily of small and marginal farmers. And when I say small and marginal farmers, it is less than 2 hectares of land, which the majority, that is about 60 to 70% of Indian farmers, including women, work on. Now, all this is supposed to be given or initiated under contract farming to be able to expand, the definition of a farm, or convert small farm into large farm on the purposes of, in quotes, efficiency. Crop choices and cultivation practices, again, to be decided by the corporates which take these farms on contract farming. There is something called a minimum selling price, because there is very little agriculture support which is given to the farmers in terms of budgets and in terms of policies, etc. Of course, we don't have a planning board or a planning commission anymore. And at least a minimum selling price guaranteed some basic income to the majority of the farmers. Now, also what this means is that, and this is extremely important, PDS is public distribution system. This was introduced several decades back, and something which we got advanced or improved through a long struggle of 7 or 8 years at a national level, to a right to food for the citizens of the country, which is now enshrined in the Constitution of India. So what this act does is that, apart from the many other issues, it says it takes away or attacks, reduces the right to food which is guaranteed, and goes against the constitution of the country. And of course, the issues of resolution, now you can't go to the court anymore. This is what the act said. And arbitration will be done by local bureaucrats or government officers. This act started in September 2020. The farmers' movement started absolutely immediately on the promulgation of these Farm Acts which were there. Now, please remember, these Farm Acts were not debated in Parliament. They were not discussed. There was no public response which was passed at all. And the northern part of India, which is called the bowl of food, particularly wheat and other kinds of cash crops, that is the Punjab, Haryana, the north-west region of the country, they immediately went on strike, farmers, men, women, and got support nationally from every section, including from all the opposition parties, who fought and struggled for some kind of debate in Parliament. But this was, of course, because of majoritarian rule, was taken away. In fact, even internationally, a lot of, like Greta and various other people, there were many demonstrations which were held in Europe in support of this movement. Now, also very, very proud to say that this is the longest struggle in recorded world history of agricultural workers. So it's one of the most inspiring that they managed to carry on this struggle for such a long period of time, in spite of huge state repression. The demonstrations were absolutely peaceful, following the Gandhian principle of non-violence. And this issue of a democratic, peaceful movement met a huge amount of state repression. And this is, we are still call ourselves a democracy, but internationally, several years ago, we have been downgraded from a democracy to a flawed democracy. And this showed particularly where the farmers' movements were concerned. There was firing, there were attacks on every demonstration, which was there of hundreds and thousands of farmers, barricades, wires, a massive number of arrests. Some farmers are still in jail and the cases are going on. It's 4 or 5 years, and 700 farmers, including women, died in this entire structure. But the movement carried on very strongly, getting a huge amount of support from every section, whether it's academics or students or trade unions or informal workers, you just name it, tribals, they were all very much part of this demonstrations. And the government was forced after a year or after 14 months to actually withdraw the Farm Acts. This was a huge victory. The role of women is something which was, I think, not only inspiring, it just gave us so much of courage to link up and to fight on other issues also. And what this participation of women did is that it broke a whole number. And I'm not saying it's ideal that it's done, but at least for a period of time. And it broke many patriarchal rigidities which existed in class terms. Yeah. And many
1 minute.
issues, yeah, many new issues which were introduced, which are all there, including the sharing of unpaid work. Now, I will just share a few pictures with you, which I think really resonate much, much more than just talking for another few minutes. This, of course, is the women driving tractors, which was a first visible show of women really coming out. And these are older women. They're not younger women who were there. The 1 year celebration, very, very important, which we celebrated all over the country. The workers and the unions, formal, unorganized, who became part of this in spite of this huge repression which was there. And this, I think, really spoke on the unpaid work component, that the men and women together shared. This is not housework, this is community work to feed the farmers who were on strike. Repression took various forms, direct attacks, which were there, firing, as you can see, and tear gas shells, which were used, barbed wires. This was, I think, one of the most cruel, work against your own citizens. And this is supposedly a democratic country. And of course, the issue of the large number of women. Yellow represents courage. It represents one of our main freedom fighters who is there. And the most inspiring, and this is something which is carrying on at all different levels, is the women who have now taken to the streets in many different kinds of ways, inspiring us with the fire of their power. Thank you so much. I'm sorry if I went a little beyond time.
That's okay. Thank you, Ritu, for drawing attention to the gendered dimensions of the crisis and resistance, and also for reminding us of this the importance and centrality of grassroots mobilization. Thank you. So please, if you have any questions, you can add them in the Q&A box, and we will answer them after the presentations. So next, we will hear from Eunice Sanchez, political scientist and data analyst with extensive experience in public policy, social well-being, and sustainable development. Her work focuses on evidence-based policymaking, particularly in areas related to well-being, blue economy, and governance. Today, Eunice will focus on care work and its effects on health in Chile. So please.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate. Today I'm going to present the impact of caregiving on women's health in Chile. The care report published by the Social Observatory in Chile found that 32.4% of caregivers experience significant physical and emotional strain, highlighting the importance of offering them comprehensive support. The three main support needs that caregivers reported were technical or professional assistance for caregiving, sharing caregiving responsibilities with others, and psychosocial support or healthcare for themselves. The objectives of this study were contribute to the knowledge and analysis of the impact of care work on the health of women caregivers, identify the variables that influence the physical and mental health of caregivers in order to promote their autonomy and prevent their dependency, estimate the indicator of years of healthy life loss as a result of caregiving, and investigate the variables that influence caregivers' need for care and develop gender-sensitive public policies that provide support to prevent the deterioration of caregivers' health. In Chile, as in much of Latin America, caregiving is highly gendered. 71% of caregivers are women, and most of her work is unpaid, regardless of education level or residence. A caregiver was defined as someone who spends 4 or more hours per day caring for others. In Chile, on average, women in rural areas spend 7.8 hours on housework and caregiving, while men spend 3.6. In urban areas, the pattern is similar. Women dedicate 7.1 hours in average to unpaid work compared to 3.9 hours for men. To measure the health impact of caregiving, the study aimed to calculate disability-adjusted life years attributed to caregiving in Chile. We performed data analysis to determine who are the caregivers by sex, age, laboral status, educational level, etc., using the social well-being survey, and the results were validated with other sources such as National Employment Survey and National Time Use Survey. We didn't have enough information about the specific illness that affect caregivers in Chile. For that reason, we collect data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System as training data. With that information, we perform machine learning models to estimate the likelihood of caregivers developing illness linked to caregiving stress, such as mental disorders, musculoskeletal conditions, and diabetes. Finally, we use data from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation to determine the total DALYs for each of that conditions and their impact per age group. The key findings are that there is a persistent gender inequality that assigns caregiving largely to women. That limits their participation in the labor market and undermines their well-being. Caregiving affects multiple aspects of life, including careers, income, well-being, and health. 48% of women are out of labor market compared to 29% of men. The primary reason women don't seek jobs is family caregiving responsibilities, whereas men cite education or studies as their main reason, and just 3.1 for ongoing family responsibilities. 44.2% of women have left a job to care for children or dependents compared to just 8.1 of men. Speaking about finances, 44% of households where the head is a caregiver face financial difficulties and insufficient income versus 30% of households headed by no caregivers. About well-being, 30% of caregivers report never feel interest or pleasure in daily activities compared to 40% of non-caregivers. For speak about health, first the definition. DALI for disease or health conditions are the sum of the years of life lost due to premature mortality plus the years lived with a disability due to prevalent cases of the disease or health condition in a population. This data is for 2021. Caregiving was linked to 64% of depression-related disability adjusted life years in women. 70.7% of female caregivers reported depressive symptoms against 3.4% of non-caregivers. 10.87% of male caregivers reported depressive symptoms versus 1.53% of non-caregivers. That means that 50% of deaths could be attributed to the caregiver work. Among women aged 20 to 44, 89% of arthritis and osteoarthritis-related health loss was associated with caregiving. Young female caregivers show a 8% diagnosis rate versus 0.2% in non-caregivers. Also, young male caregivers show a 10% diagnosis rate compared to 0.15% in non-caregivers, which is equal to 77% of health loss. This could mean that caregiving activities contribute to the acceleration of the onset of muscle and bone disorders. In 2021, diabetes type 2 caused a loss of 181.4 thousand of years of healthy life among women aged 20 and older. An estimate 9% of these deaths are explained by the impact of caregiver burden on their health. 10% of deaths due to diabetes in men could be attributed to the burden of caring for others. So the policy recommendations are mainly to offer integrated health programs for caregivers with gender-sensitive services that include mental and physical health care in accessible formats as extended hours, telemedicine, and home visits. An economic evaluation of care work, that is conduct economic evaluation of caregiving work within the national GDP to highlight the contribution caregivers make to the national economy and to that extent invest in protecting their health and training programs for caregivers. It will be also important to estimate the cost to health system of treating conditions related to care overload. Also, it's very important the legal and institutional reform to recognize unpaid care in social protection systems and including in vital statistics and offer formal benefits to reduce long-term gender inequalities. So supporting caregivers is critical for social justice. Thus findings show that care work is a hidden driver of health inequality and economic exclusion. Supporting caregivers, especially women, is critical for advancing social justice and well-being. It recommended that the political declaration of the Second World Summit for Social Development 2025 explicitly address unpaid care as a structural issue, with dedicated policy measures and investments in care systems. By doing so, we not only uphold gender equality, but also build healthier and more inclusive societies. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Eunice, for illustrating how care work, which is also many times invisible, how it also has measurable health impacts, particularly for women. And I think that this also illustrated well how these like concrete differences between caregivers, or the impact of caregiving on health. So very interesting study. Thank you very much. So next we will hear from Ronel Burger, who is a development economist from Stellenbosch University with expertise in health equity and public service delivery in African contexts, towards universal health coverage in South Africa.
Fantastic, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Good afternoon. I'm Ronel Burger from Stellenbosch University, and today I'll be talking about South Africa's journey towards universal health coverage, what it is, why it matters, where we stand, and how we can move forward. Progress towards universal health coverage in South Africa has been shaped both by achievements, but also by persistent challenges. With the presentation, I will critically assess the barriers, reflect on key lessons, particularly from HIV and COVID pandemics, that hold valuable insights for advancing UHC, both in South Africa, but also internationally. While today's focus is South Africa, the lessons that we draw from the HIV scale-up to COVID resilience are directly relevant to low middle income countries grappling with the dual burdens of infectious and also non-communicable diseases. Firstly, I just wanted to get all of us on the same page by reminding us of the definition of universal coverage. According to the WHO, universal coverage, or UHC, means every person can obtain the health services they need, and health services very broadly defined to include promotion, prevention, treatment, rehabilitation, and palliative care. And they can get these services when and where they need them without suffering financial hardship. And it's about more than expanding clinics and funding. It's about ensuring quality, equity, and financial protection for all. In South Africa, we've had a long journey over the past 30 years. Despite 30 years of pro-poor reforms, our health system unfortunately remained deeply polarized. Similar to many other low and middle income countries, South Africa has a comprehensive but also very expensive private sector, and then an overburdened public sector, which is affordable but under-resourced, and the services that it provides is uneven in its quality. Addressing this duality is essential for making meaningful progress towards UHC in South Africa. Since the political transition in 1994, our country has invested heavily in expanding and strengthening its public health system to improve outcomes for people with low incomes. In 1994, the country introduced free care for pregnant mothers and young children, followed by free primary care for all in 1996. Over the same period, the primary healthcare facility network was substantially expanded, with more than 1,300 clinics built or upgraded. To ensure that resources reach those in most need, budget allocations have been rebalanced geographically and functionally, although the extent of that, the adequacy of the extent of that can be debated. But what we can see here is that there has been remarkable improvement in terms of the affordability ratios. And of course, just affordability ratios show the share of household non-food expenditure going towards healthcare costs. In the literature, we often use 10% as a benchmark to flag an expenditure share that is likely to force trade-offs with other essential needs for poor households. So as long as it's below 10%, it's seen as relatively acceptable. And from the graphs, you will see that between 1993 and 2003, affordability ratios declined. Not shown here, the catastrophic cost also declined. And in 2008, in terms of prohibitive cost as reason for not consulting, in 2008, it was around 4% for the bottom quintile of households, whereas it was around 8% in 1993 before these reforms were were instituted. However, despite these reforms, what we see is that there are enduring inequalities in health outcomes. South Africa spends more per capita than many other lower income countries, yet we underperform on key health indicators. Our neonatal mortality, though improving, remains higher than peers of similar income levels. Maternal mortality still lags, even adjusting for HIV. And audits suggested about a quarter of our neonatal deaths and 60% of institutional maternal deaths would be are preventable. Then also, just in general, disappointing health outcomes. The under 5 mortality in 2016 was 26 per 1,000 live births for the wealthiest quintile versus the much higher 60 per 1,000 for the poorest quintile. And what we know in South Africa is diseases of poverty such as HIV, TB, and diarrhea are almost non-existent among the affluent, but highly prevalent amongst low-income households. Also, a lot of geographic disparities persist and show large differences in child mortality and morbidity. Two recent pandemics provide insightful windows on health inequalities in the country. Looking at self-reported data in South Africa's National Income Survey, we see big declines in self-reported poor health, and then again increases between 2017 and 2021. This is not what's shown here, but this is just to provide the bigger picture. These large changes are expected given the impact of these pandemics. In South Africa, there were 3 million HIV deaths between 1997 and 2010, representing an average of about 200,000 additional deaths per year versus the baseline or comparative baseline of 450 annual deaths. So it's a really substantial increase. And in terms of official COVID deaths, it was around 90,000, but the excess mortality also suggests about 250,000 deaths, which again is around sort of half of the baseline annual mortality. Looking at the census and the community survey data, which is what is shown here, this provides a window on the HIV period in 2001, and one can consider that sort of pre, and then 2007 is really one of the high points in terms of HIV prevalence. And then, of course, we saw the rapid expansion of ARTs, which then again helped to increase life expectancy. And in South Africa, 1 in 5 adults have HIV. In other countries, one would not be able to see such stark patterns in life expectancy over this period. But the point really here is about it hitting the poorest households, the lowest income households, the hardest. And that is also a pattern that we see with HIV data. Here we look at self-reported poor and fair health, comparing the National Income Dynamics study data for 2017, its pre-COVID period, with the NITSCRAM data that was gathered during COVID. And what we see here is sort of a rapid increase in individuals reporting poor or fair health, and also it being very concentrated amongst the lowest quintiles. What we also know in South Africa is that there are persistent problems with the quality of care. Standardized patient studies found missed opportunities for hypertension screening, contraception advice, TB diagnosis in public clinics. And surveys often report stockouts of TB drugs, frequent waiting time complaints, and rudeness, especially in poorer districts. And I think what is interesting is also to start to think about the roots of these. This is now not empirical analysis, but more in terms of dialogues. There are several entrenched mindsets that hinder reform, an overemphasis on curative over preventative care. Then also what we've seen, particularly in COVID in the country, is how the narrow biomedical focus that overlooks social circumstances can hinder the formulation of policies that seek to curtail not only the health-specific cost of a pandemic, but also the social consequences of the pandemic. Then also very exciting, recent work by some of the multidisciplinary teams that I'm part of, that include social workers, microbiologists, data scientists, dietitians, large variety of different people, showed us just how dramatic the differences in living conditions are between the poorest households and those, and particularly those living in informal housing, and to what extent the focus on curative inequalities and inequalities in healthcare means that we miss a lot of the bigger inequalities, the roots of the inequalities that originate in living circumstances. And paired with that, the importance of the environment and inequalities in the environment, inequalities in measuring the quality of the environment, access to data on air quality, which is often not available for many of the low-income neighborhoods. And of course, to enable just transition and environmental health, we need to invest in cleaner energy, reliable water and sanitation, and also housing upgrades and informal settlements. In terms of reforms, to regain trust and accelerate universal health coverage, we must get the basics right, ensure consistent water, electricity, and drug supplies, improve air quality. We need to anchor reforms in evidence to foster transparency and credibility. We need to expand interdisciplinary research on social determinants and policy coordination with a specific focus on environment and the contribution of the environment to health. We need to have real-time data systems to track coverage and performance. We need to prioritize health worker recruitment, training, and morale. In summary, I think South Africa is an interesting case study for other low and middle income countries because it has made important strides with clinic expansion, user fee abolition, and budget reallocations. But despite those moves, despite those shifts, deep inequalities still persist. The pandemic exposed more cracks. We had supply chain breakdowns at key hospitals, uncertain post-COVID outcomes, and alarmingly low public trust. We're suffering with fiscal constraints after COVID as well. And I think for me, one of the most important lessons that COVID has taught us is about vaccine hesitancy. Initially, very often we attribute it to specific information and rumors that were circulating. But I think subsequently, a lot of the analysis have asked whether we shouldn't be more concerned about the fact that these things were believed and that they reflect a crisis of confidence in the systems themselves. It's about the trust and whether or not there's trust in the health system. To conclude, I argue here that universal health coverage demands a dual approach. We need to bolster the public sector's quality and reach while designing reforms that protect the most vulnerable. We must address social determinants, build robust data systems, foster public trust through transparency and accountability. While each country's context differs, the core pillars, financing, equity, data systems, workforce support, and social determinants are universal to any country pursuing universal health coverage. The path to universal coverage is challenging, but achievable. I look forward to your questions and discussion, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vanel, for sharing your insights on both the structural challenges, but also the opportunities in the journey towards universal health coverage. And indeed also thank you for these concrete recommendations that definitely also are valuable for the discussions related to the World Social Summit. So next we will hear our last speaker for today, Tuuli Hirvilammi, who is senior lecturer at Tampere University. And she's an expert in sustainable welfare research with background in social policy. And research interests include sustainable well-being, eco-welfare states, and eco-social policies. So, okay, thank you. So, please, Tuuli, you can start.
Yes, thank you, Merita, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here to talk about social justice in times of climate change and some options for eco-social policy in Europe. So this is my title for the last session for this webinar. And indeed, my focus is much less global and more Eurocentric than maybe the previous speakers had. However, I think I always talk about the topics about social justice and social policy in a planetary context, which means that there is always this kind of notion and acknowledgement that we live in a shared planet and we have to share our well-being within our global community. But yes, I work as a researcher in Finland, in Tampere, and here we have some research projects that relate to these topics. We have studied eco-welfare state, also this kind of beyond GDP economy that Heikki talked about. We also try to enhance the policies towards sustainable and inclusive well-being at the EU level with different partners in merge project. And I draw on all these projects in this presentation, but also on ongoing work and research on the topic. And indeed, in my title, I have this climate change focus, but I would rather talk about the planetary crisis instead of climate crisis or climate emergency. We are witnessing a planetary crisis, and this kind of dashboard of planetary health check is one indication of that planetary crisis. In previous presentation, we heard and talked about human health and health promotion, but maybe we also have to focus on promoting the planetary health. And it's also a question for social summit, World Social Summit and social policies, so because of course, if we are in this trend that the planetary science and planetary processes are deteriorating and we move towards this high-risk zone, we will witness more human suffering. And here the current situation is that we have already transgressed 6 of the planetary boundaries. We have crossed the ozone the change in biosphere integrity, so basically the biodiversity loss, and we have transgressed the boundaries in terms of geochemical flows and climate change for sure, and also we in land system change we are moving towards a high risk zone as well as with fresh water change and ocean acidification. And I think you know the impacts of these trends even more, because yes, I took this picture from the latest state of the climate report on planet Earth publication that has been published quite many years ago by researcher community, main author William J. Ripple. I took this picture from their article, and again paid attention that all these pictures are taken outside Europe. There is one picture from California, one from Bangladesh, one from Haiti, Philippines, etc. So you see a lot of human suffering. You see droughts, floods. You see forest fires, etc. And in the pictures, in the article, they also show these trends where you can clearly see that how the global tree cover loss due to fires, for example, is increasing, as well as are the extremely hot days relative to the earlier period of time. So these are the clear signs that indeed the planetary crisis is deteriorating human health and well-being as well. And moreover, this is also a question of social justice. So if we think about the climate change, it is connected to this kind of phenomena called triple injustice. Yankov, in his book Heat, Greed and Human Need, defined triple injustice in these terms: that poor emit less, suffer more, and bear the brunt of climate mitigation policies. So if indeed the climate change is related to different kind of inequalities, like unequal contribution, unequal impact, and unequal preparedness. And if we look at the climate inequality report published in 2023, you can easily see how the comparison of different population groups shows this triple injustice phenomena. First, if we focus on the green bar, on the middle bar, I think that's the most obvious and most often discussed the contribution, namely how much emissions a different population group cause. And if you look at the top 10 or middle 40% of the population, the emissions are for sure much higher than the bottom 50. And what is not shown in this picture is that the top 1% of the population emits almost as much as the bottom 50% of the population. So we can clearly talk about extreme carbon inequality. And then if we look at the other side of the triple injustice, namely the how much different population groups will be suffered by climate change or the increasing emissions, we look at the red bar, which we see that, of course, the bottom 50% of the populations will face like I would say quite significantly amount of the risk compared, or the losses or damage compared to the top 10% of the population. And this is of course linked to the capacity to finance and capacity to adapt to climate change impacts. But it's also related to the capacity to finance, like if we think who could finance and who could accelerate the climate actions in the global community. Those, of course, who own more, they have better capacity to finance the transformation. And here you see the top 10% capacity to finance is almost equal to the relative losses experienced by the bottom 50. And whereas the capacity to finance by bottom 50 is almost equal to the relative losses witnessed by top 10. So surely, and from these bars, you understand that the climate change is a social question. It's a question of social disparities, distribution of power and wealth. And if we move on, we also can sharpen our focus to per capita emissions, even closer look at different areas, geographic areas in the world. And for example, we can see that in Europe, the top 10% has almost 2 times, or even more than 2 times, almost 3 times bigger carbon emissions, carbon footprints than the middle 40% of the population, whereas, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the distinction or the difference is not so big, but the same pattern, the same trend is seen in all continents and in all areas. So the top 10% of the population emits much more. And this is a challenge, and all these climate inequalities is a challenge that has increasingly been addressed by scholars who are studying sustainable welfare and eco-social policies. So, for example, I'm a researcher with a background in social policy. We have other researchers in political science, in economic, in social policy, public policy, sociology, social work, health science, who try to integrate these environmental challenges or planetary crises and our kind of pathway towards ecological sustainability with social policies in very broad terms. And we have a global network called Sustainable Welfare and Eco-Social Policy network. We organize colloquiums and publish a newsletter. So if you're interested, you may want to have a look at this at our website. And we also, within this community, scholars have published special issues and books, and it's indeed increasing because there is certainly a demand for this kind of interdisciplinary research on these topics. And we talk about eco-social policies, and I heard, for example, Katja already mentioned it in her presentation earlier today. But just to clarify and maybe define what it means, what are eco-social policies, and the very main idea behind is to combine environmental social goals. So instead of first establishing some kind of climate mitigation policies that might have then regressive impacts for lower income households, for example, so that there will be this kind of extra burden that they can't, for example, pay for their energy bills, and they will witness some kind of energy vulnerability or poverty even, then we should have some kind of countervailing social policies to repair or restore the balance, let's say, or to mitigate the poverty among those affected households. So instead of this, or to circumvent this kind of long route with countervailing social policies, we should and we could establish and implement integrated eco-social policies that simultaneously serve two goals, that they won't try to be environmental in reducing emissions or natural resource use or whatever planetary trends, and that they are also at the same time social in recognizing and meeting a basic need, and for example by reducing energy bills. But the eco-social policies are integrative by purpose. There is this kind of intentional element or explicit element, and this kind of policy integration can be two-directional. That if we think about the welfare state in Europe and other countries.
1 minute.
Okay, we have this ecological, so we can add the ecological sustainability to that picture, and then we can also think about adding social to environmental problems. And we have published an article on social policy in a climate emergency context, where we argue that we have to revise our established and traditional concepts of risk, citizenship, welfare regimes, and well-being. But with the interest, because of the interest of the time, I move on to just concluding with how the social policy should revise its goals. So social policy is about sufficient standard of living for all by preventing poverty and restraining overconsumption. It should steer human activities to respect the planetary boundaries and to prevent disastrous environmental impacts. It should support the equal possibilities and use the social security to promote societal change. This can be used, for example, by establishing different kind of universal basic services. And then it should also secure the freedom and maintain economically efficient. And I wanted to mention this table one still, because it shows and brings together different policy instruments, very concrete policy instruments that have been suggested in eco-social policy literature and post-growth literature. For example, universal basic services is mentioned there, as was discussed today as well. Wealth tax, maximum income, care income, job guarantee, working time reduction, well-being budgets, or for example, future generations acts could be a very feasible and very kind of concrete policy measures that can be also promoted at the international level, but also at the national or even regional and local level to improve well-being within planetary boundaries. And it's also inclusive if we combine these integrated eco-social policies. But thanks for your attention, and I finish here.
Thank you, Tuuli. So now we heard four different aspects of social inclusion and investments in well-being. And just to say a few words, I think to wrap up the panel, I think that what stands out from both the Indian and Chilean cases is how deeply social inequalities, particularly those related to gender, are also embedded in these structures of economies and social systems, whether it's the unpaid care work or care work in Chile or these massive participations of rural women in India. And these are also not isolated issues, because they also speak directly to these needs for policies to recognize and redistribute care, support women's autonomy, and also embed social justice in these economic and also governance frameworks. And then after these two presentations, we heard about what can be done by investing in public policies. In the case of South Africa, in extending universal health coverage, and then lastly, the opportunities of eco-social policies to fight climate crisis. One issue that is definitely was missed in the priorities of the first World Social Summit. Now, we do have a question here this is actually something that anyone open to any speaker. It says, when discussing equity and inclusion in global policy frameworks, what are the key indicators and measures used to assess inclusiveness and equitable outcomes? For example, how are concepts such as equitable governance and social inclusion evaluated in practice? Does anyone of you want to start, or maybe do you have a...
Maybe I can say at least that there are abundance of different indicator dashboards that try to cover both the social inclusion and also the social disparities and equality. So it's difficult to name only some metrics, but I think, for example, the Heikki shared the Finnish example. That's one. There is like human development indicator. Maybe it's one, but not so much focusing on inclusiveness. Instead of apart from Gini efficiency and those kind of metrics, there are also, of course, metrics related to gender equality, or for example, the how universal health coverage is. But you must know the other examples as well. I just know that these aspects are increasingly integrated into for example, the OECD House Life Wellbeing Index, and the inclusion aspect is part of the picture along the well-being and sustainability dimensions.
I'd just like to add on from India's experience. Of course, like Tuuli said, it's impossible to identify one or two. I mean, there are just so many. But two or three which concern us very much in India, and which is actually increasing, is two or three of them. One is the percentage of households or population which cannot afford a nutritious meal a day. And that is the basis of everything. I mean, what's the point? We are now the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, but it means nothing for the majority of the people. So, in fact, in India, 76% of Indian households cannot afford one nutritious meal. So I think nutrition becomes one indicator if one has to, or hunger, whichever way one puts it. Another is the issue of health. And, as a basic fundamental, that how much of out-of-pocket expenses go for private health care. And I think this issue of privatization of public health is something which is very, very problematic, not only in India, but also in several other countries. The third, I think, which is a takeoff very much on the issue of climate change and environmental presentation, which is there, is the level of deforestation, which impacts the majority of India's population and of that of developing countries, very much so, because most of them reside in the rural areas. In fact, in India, there has been a reversal of, normally when development increases, the percentage of population in urban and in industry in particular increases. But in fact, there has been a reverse migration of men and particularly women into rural areas. So I think that component linking up the access to CPRs, common property resources, and forest cover becomes a very essential aspect. There are several others which one can talk about. For India, caste and religion are becoming very, very major issues. It was there earlier, but I think now also the lack of macro data. We've not had a census for a very long time, and macro data and sex disaggregated macro data. I mean, not only two sexes, but the other sexes also, on which, again, there is very, very little information.
Thank you. So there's one question. Sorry. Yeah, Ronald, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I can add to that, especially in terms of the tracking. I think some of the difficulty is that a lot of the data that we have is often very macro and released with a very long lag. And I think, if one really wants to become very serious about having a society that's more inclusive, it's also really vital that we have investment in rapid data systems that can assess the impact of policies and the weaknesses of policies in terms of inclusion far sooner, and at local level.
Yeah.
And I think for that as well, civil society can be really, really important. It doesn't help if 5 years later we found out that the specific well-intentioned policy had dismal performance in terms of inclusiveness, and we've missed that because of slow data processes and macro data.
So there's a question in the chat, in the Q&A box. How can we come together to find a common language or metrics to make clear the fundamental relationship between planetary well-being and human well-being?
Can I start just quickly
Yes.
to address this question? I think that's very important because indeed this kind of playing with different words can also mislead our journey from the common goal, that there seems to be very different like alternative, for example, alternative economy is called with many names, whether it's like donut economy or well-being economy, and there are also many different metrics that actually points towards the same direction, that they try to address exactly the well-being aspects, like well-being now, well-being in the future, the sustainability, but also the nature sustainability. So shortly, in our merge project, we have converged towards the phrase sustainable and inclusive well-being, and it is at the same time kind of planetary well-being notion, and we try that we hope it will fly, because it has been in the UN processes already. So sustainable and inclusive well-being refers both to planetary and human well-being, including this inclusion aspect.
Does anyone, the other panelists,
There
would like
are
to?
one or two issues in the chat box instead of the Q&A, I think. Something on large-scale initiatives like Wikipedia projects. Is there an active global
Yes.
program? Yeah.
That can finance new large-scale initiatives like the Wikimedia project. Is there an active global program that can finance new large-scale initiatives like the Wikimedia projects? This may be more, I don't know, more generally, I guess. So if somebody knows about these, you can maybe also reply directly. So I would like to ask something from Eunice, because in your research, you show a very striking link between caregiving and specific health conditions. So you did mention some policy interventions. What would be like if you would sort of think about something that what would you prioritize to reduce these health impacts of caregiving? And maybe also this the study was done in Chile, but maybe also if you want to comment on how these maybe relate also to other countries, or how do you think that how specific this is for Chile, the case?
Well, I think the caregivers need care also. So the society has to focus in that people, because they provide an important service to the society. So the programs that has to see the health of the well-being of the caregivers, and provide not just health services, if not also psychological services, and help to them to take care for people, and also give their social assistance, and in general take care about them.
Thank you. This is important indeed. I think that we have now reached the end of the discussions. Before you leave, let's give Katja the floor. But I would, from my part, I would like to thank everyone. This was very, very fruitful and very interesting discussions from different aspects of well-being and social inclusion. And Katja, if you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you.
The final words.
Thank you very much, Marita, and thanks to all the panelists and speakers on behalf of UNRIST. Also, we are very pleased to have the chance to have this conversation, really, and I think it was so rich in terms of these empirical case studies and the policy recommendations that you provided. I think we had examples from all regions around the world, from different sectors. I think every presentation kind of, made me think of something I hadn't thought about before. I think, we have learned a lot. We had a big topic for this webinar: resilient societies, social justice, social cohesion, well-being, and how we can bring all this evidence and also the narratives and the debates into the social summit negotiations to make sure that, you know, we really harness that opportunity that we talk about social development, and that social development is now back at the center of debates, together, of course, with the discussions around how to finance them. So this was an excellent opportunity to discuss different issues, and yeah, many, many thanks. We have a small feedback survey, I guess, when we close the seminar, so please take a minute to provide us with your feedback. We try to also respond to some questions in writing, and feel free to reach out with any feedback and comments. You will also find recordings of this webinar on the website later on. Please stay tuned and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.